In the frigid waters of the North Pacific, where the Bering Sea meets the vast expanse of the ocean, a naval battle unfolded on the 26th of March, 1943, that would become the longest daylight surface naval engagement of the Pacific War. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands, fought in the shadow of Soviet territory just south of the Kamchatka Peninsula, represents one of World War II's most unusual naval confrontations, a pure surface action fought without air support, submarines, or even radar-directed fire for most of the engagement. The morning of March 26th dawned cold and gray over the North Pacific. The temperature hovered just above freezing, and a light wind rippled across the steel-gray waters. Visibility stretched for miles under the overcast sky, creating perfect conditions for what would become a classic naval surface action. Neither side expected to meet that morning, yet both the Imperial Japanese Navy and the United States Navy had dispatched powerful surface forces into these remote waters, setting the stage for an encounter that would help determine the fate of Japan's northernmost conquests. The Aleutian Islands, that 1,000-mile chain of volcanic islands stretching from Alaska toward Asia, had become an unlikely theater of war. Most Americans had never heard of places like Attu, Kiska, or Adak before 1942. These barren, fog-shrouded islands seemed to offer little strategic value, yet they had drawn the attention of Japanese military planners who saw them as both a defensive buffer for the home islands and a potential stepping stone for operations against the North American mainland. The psychological impact of Japanese forces occupying American soil, the first foreign occupation of American territory since the War of 1812, had prompted a significant American military response. The battle that would unfold near the Komandorski Islands emerged from a fundamental strategic problem facing the Japanese occupation forces on Attu and Kiska. These isolated garrisons, thousands of miles from Japan and hundreds of miles from the nearest Japanese base, required regular supply runs to sustain themselves. The Americans, operating from newly constructed bases on Adak and Kamchatka, had positioned themselves to interdict these supply lines. Every Japanese convoy attempting to reach the occupied islands faced the threat of American submarines, aircraft, and surface vessels. By March 1943, the situation for the Japanese garrisons had become increasingly desperate. The destroyer transport runs that had sustained them through the winter were no longer sufficient. Larger cargo vessels were needed to deliver the heavy equipment, ammunition, and supplies necessary to fortify the islands against the anticipated American invasion. The Japanese Navy organized a major convoy operation, dispatching 2 large converted cruisers carrying supplies and reinforcements, escorted by a powerful force of cruisers and destroyers. The American response to this threat came in the form of Task Group 16.6, a small but potent force built around the heavy cruiser Salt Lake City and the light cruiser Richmond. Rear Admiral Charles McMorris, commanding from Richmond, had received intelligence suggesting a Japanese convoy might attempt to reach Attu. His orders were clear: intercept and destroy any Japanese shipping attempting to resupply the occupied islands. McMorris had positioned his force to patrol the likely convoy routes, not knowing that he was about to encounter a Japanese force significantly more powerful than his own. The strategic significance of this impending clash extended far beyond the immediate question of supplies reaching Attu. The Aleutian campaign had already tied down significant American and Japanese resources that might have been employed elsewhere in the Pacific. For the Americans, clearing the Japanese from the Aleutians would eliminate a potential threat to Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, while freeing up forces for operations in the Central Pacific. For the Japanese, maintaining their Aleutian garrisons provided a northern anchor for their defensive perimeter and prevented the Americans from using the islands as bases for operations against the Kuril Islands or even the Japanese home islands. As dawn broke on March 26th, neither Admiral McMorris nor Vice Admiral Boshiro Hosogaya, commanding the Japanese force, anticipated the battle that was about to begin. Hosogaya's force had departed from Paramushiro in the Kuril Islands several days earlier, taking a circuitous route to avoid American submarines and aircraft. His convoy consisted of 2 converted cruisers, Asaka Maru and Sakito Maru, carrying vital supplies and reinforcements. These vulnerable vessels were protected by the heavy cruisers, Nachi and Maya, the light cruisers, Tama and Abukuma, and the destroyers Wakaba, Hatsushimo, Ikazuchi, and Inazuma, a force that significantly outgunned the American task group. The Japanese occupation of Attu and Kiska in June 1942 had been part of a complex strategic operation tied to the Midway Campaign. While the main Japanese fleet struck at Midway Island, a northern force had seized these westernmost islands of the Aleutian chain. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had intended this northern operation to serve multiple purposes. It would divide American forces, create a defensive buffer for the Japanese home islands, and potentially provide bases for future operations against Alaska and the North American mainland. The initial Japanese landings on June 6 to 7, 1,942, had met virtually no resistance. Attu's population consisted of just 45 Aleut natives and 2 American missionaries, while Kiska housed only a small naval weather station that had been evacuated before the Japanese arrival. The ease of these occupations, however, masked the enormous logistical challenges that would plague the Japanese forces throughout their occupation. The Aleutian Islands offered some of the most inhospitable conditions anywhere in the Pacific theater: perpetual fog, violent storms, and temperatures that could shift from near freezing to surprisingly mild within hours. The Japanese had initially garrisoned Attu with approximately 2,500 troops, and Kiska with about 5,400. These forces immediately began constructing defensive positions, airfields, and support facilities. The engineers faced extraordinary challenges. The volcanic soil of the islands turned into deep mud when disturbed. The constant fog and rain made construction work miserable and dangerous. Equipment rusted at an alarming rate in the salt-laden air. The Japanese soldiers, most of whom had never experienced such conditions, suffered from exposure, trench foot, and psychological stress caused by the isolation and harsh environment. Supply operations to these remote garrisons quickly became the critical vulnerability in Japan's Aleutian strategy. The distance from Japan to Attu was approximately 2,000 miles, with the convoy route passing through some of the most dangerous waters in the Pacific. The Bering Sea and North Pacific were notorious for sudden storms that could scatter or sink a convoy. Even in good weather, the perpetual fog made navigation hazardous. American submarines operating from Dutch Harbor and later from Adak posed a constant threat to Japanese shipping. The American response to the Japanese occupation had been swift and determined. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, had immediately recognized the political and psychological importance of ejecting the Japanese from American soil. Despite the pressing demands of operations in the Solomon Islands and New Guinea, significant forces were allocated to the Aleutian theater. The Americans began a systematic campaign to isolate and eventually recapture the occupied islands. The construction of American bases on Adak and Amchitka had fundamentally altered the strategic equation in the Aleutians. Adak, occupied by American forces in August 1942, lay just 250 miles from Kiska. Engineers had performed miraculous feats of construction, building an airfield on the tundra in less than 2 weeks. Amchitka, even closer to Kiska, had been occupied in January 1943. From these bases, American aircraft could strike at Japanese shipping and installations, while American surface forces could patrol the sea lanes between the Kurils and the occupied islands. By early 1943, the Japanese garrisons on Attu and Kiska were effectively under siege. American air raids, when weather permitted, had destroyed many of the facilities so laboriously constructed by the Japanese. Submarine attacks had sunk several supply vessels, including the destroyer Ninohi in July 1942. The Japanese had been forced to rely increasingly on fast destroyer runs, similar to the Tokyo Express operations in the Solomon Islands, to deliver supplies under cover of fog and darkness. These runs could deliver only limited quantities of supplies, insufficient to properly fortify the islands or sustain the garrisons indefinitely. The Japanese Navy had attempted several convoy operations using larger vessels, but these had largely failed due to American opposition and weather. In March 1943, the situation had become critical. Intelligence reports suggested the Americans were preparing for an invasion of the occupied islands. The garrisons needed heavy equipment, ammunition, and reinforcements if they were to have any hope of resisting an American assault. Vice Admiral Hosogaya, commanding the Japanese Fifth Fleet based at Paramushiro, organized what would be the last major attempt to resupply Attu by surface convoy. The American intelligence network, including radio intercepts and coast watchers, had detected increased Japanese naval activity in the Kuriles. While the exact composition and timing of the convoy remained unknown, Admiral Thomas Kinkaid, commanding the North Pacific Force, had positioned his limited surface forces to intercept any Japanese shipping approaching the occupied islands. Task Group 16.6 under Rear Admiral McMorris represented the primary American surface striking force in the region, tasked with maintaining a barrier patrol south of the Komandorski Islands. Task Group 16.6, the American force that would fight the Battle of the Komandorski Islands, was built around two cruisers that represented different eras of American naval construction. The heavy cruiser USS Salt Lake City, commissioned in 1929, was one of the oldest heavy cruisers in the Pacific Fleet. Despite her age, Swayback Maru, as her crew affectionately called her due to her tendency to hog in heavy seas, remained a formidable warship. Her main battery of 10 8-inch guns in 4 turrets could deliver devastating firepower, and her crew, veterans of numerous Pacific engagements, including the Battle of Cape Esperance, were among the most experienced in the fleet. The light cruiser USS Richmond, Admiral McMorris's flagship, was a more modern vessel, commissioned in 1923 but extensively modernized. Though smaller than Salt Lake City and armed with 6-inch guns rather than 8-inch, Richmond was fast and maneuverable. Her crew had spent months operating in the harsh Aleutian conditions and had developed the skills necessary to fight in the unpredictable northern waters. Supporting the two cruisers were 4 destroyers: USS Bailey, USS Coghlan, USS Dale, and USS Monaghan. These destroyers, though outnumbered by their Japanese counterparts, would play crucial roles in the coming battle. The Japanese force assembled by Vice Admiral Hosogaya significantly outmatched the Americans in firepower. The heavy cruiser Nachi, Hosogaya's flagship, was one of the most powerful cruisers in the world. Completed in 1928, she displaced over 13,000 tons and mounted 10 8-inch guns in 5 twin turrets. Her sister ship Maya was equally formidable. Both vessels had been modernized with improved fire control systems and additional anti-aircraft armament. Their crews were well trained, though they had seen less combat than their American counterparts. The Japanese light cruisers Tama and Abukuma added additional firepower to Hosogaya's force. Though older and smaller than the heavy cruisers, each mounted 7 5.5-inch guns and possessed excellent torpedo armament, a capability that would prove significant in the coming battle. The Japanese destroyers Wakaba, Hatsushimo, Ikazuchi, and Inazuma were all modern vessels armed with 5-inch guns, and the deadly Type 93 long-lance torpedoes, the most effective torpedo in any Navy's inventory. The 2 converted cruisers that formed the heart of the convoy, Asaka Maru and Sakito Maru, were the reason for the entire operation. These fast merchant vessels had been requisitioned by the Japanese Navy and modified to carry troops and supplies while maintaining enough speed to keep pace with warships. Together, they carried badly needed supplies, ammunition, and reinforcements for the Attu garrison. Their cargo included anti-aircraft guns, engineering equipment, food supplies for several months, and approximately 1,500 replacement troops. Admiral McMorris faced a difficult tactical problem as he patrolled south of the Komandorski Islands. His force was outnumbered and outgunned by any likely Japanese convoy escort. His orders from Admiral Kinkaid emphasized the importance of intercepting Japanese supply efforts, but also stressed the need to preserve his limited forces. McMorris had developed a simple plan. If he encountered a superior Japanese force, he would attempt to draw them away from the convoy through aggressive maneuvering, relying on his ship's speed and the skill of his crews to avoid decisive engagement, while his destroyers attempted to reach the vulnerable transports. Vice Admiral Hosogaya's plan was equally straightforward. His powerful escort would shield the 2 transports during their high-speed run to Attu. If American forces were encountered, his superior firepower would drive them off or destroy them. Hosogaya was confident in his force's capabilities, but concerned about American air power from Adak or Amchitka. He had therefore chosen a route that would keep his force as far as possible from American airfields while still reaching Attu. What he didn't know was that weather conditions would prevent any air operations on March 26, turning the coming battle into a pure surface action. The crews on both sides had endured months of operations in the harsh Aleutian environment. The Americans had learned to deal with ice forming on their ship's superstructures, reducing stability and affecting weapon operation. They had developed techniques for operating in near-zero visibility and had practiced surface action tactics suited to the confined waters around the Aleutian Islands. The Japanese, operating from Paramushiro, had faced similar conditions and had gained valuable experience in convoy operations under Arctic conditions. At 0730 on the morning of the 26th of March, 1943, the American destroyer USS Cochrane made radar contact with unidentified vessels to the northwest. The radar return indicated multiple ships at a range of approximately 19,000 yards. Admiral McMorris, aboard Richmond, immediately ordered his force to investigate. As the American ships turned toward the contact, lookouts strained to penetrate the gray dawn light. The weather was unusually clear for the Aleutian's visibility extended to nearly 20 miles, with only a light breeze disturbing the ocean's surface. At 0820, American lookouts positively identified Japanese vessels on the horizon. The initial count suggested at least 4 enemy ships, but as the range closed, the true size of the Japanese force became apparent. McMorris faced a critical decision. His force was clearly outnumbered and outgunned, but his orders were to prevent Japanese reinforcement of Attu. After a brief consideration, McMorris decided to engage, hoping to draw the Japanese escorts away from their convoy and create an opportunity for his destroyers to attack the transports. Vice Admiral Hosogaya, aboard Nachi, was equally surprised by the encounter. His lookouts had spotted the American force at approximately the same time. Initially, Hosogaya believed he was facing only a small force of destroyers or perhaps a single cruiser. As identification improved, he realized he faced at least 2 American cruisers and several destroyers. Despite his superior firepower, Hosogaya was concerned. His primary mission was to deliver the transports safely to Attu. A prolonged engagement with American surface forces could attract enemy aircraft or submarines. At 0840, Hosogaya ordered his transports to reverse course and withdraw to the northwest, while his warships engaged the Americans. This decision, made in the heat of the moment, would prove crucial to the battle's outcome. By prioritizing the safety of his transports over aggressive action against the weaker American force, Hosogaya had already begun to cede the initiative to McMorris. The first shots of the battle were fired at 0850 when Nachi opened fire at extreme range, approximately 20,000 yards. The Japanese heavy cruisers' initial salvos fell short, but they served notice that the battle had begun. Salt Lake City responded at 0852, her forward turrets firing at Maya, which appeared to be the closest Japanese heavy cruiser. Richmond joined the action moments later, targeting the Japanese light cruiser Tama. The opening phase of the battle developed into a long-range gunnery duel, as both forces maneuvered for advantage. McMorris ordered his ships to maintain maximum range while gradually working to the southwest, hoping to draw the Japanese further from their transports. The American destroyers were ordered to make smoke to screen the cruisers, a tactic that would prove invaluable throughout the engagement. The Japanese, with their superior numbers, attempted to work around the American flanks, seeking to bring their combined firepower to bear. At 0910, Salt Lake City scored the first hit of the battle, striking Nachi with an 8-inch shell that damaged her bridge area and wounded several personnel, though not seriously. The American cruiser's gunners, despite the extreme range and the ship's tendency to roll in the slight swell, were demonstrating remarkable accuracy. Richmond, meanwhile, was engaging Tama at ranges that pushed the limits of her 6-inch gun's effectiveness. The Japanese response was swift and increasingly accurate, By 0920, both Nachi and Maya were concentrating their fire on Salt Lake City, correctly identifying her as the most dangerous American vessel. Japanese shells began falling progressively closer to the American heavy cruiser, their distinctive dye markers, pink for Nachi, green for Maya, creating colorful geysers around their target. At 0925, Salt Lake City received her first hit, an 8-inch shell that struck her forward hull but caused minimal damage. The battle had now developed into a running fight, with both forces steaming generally southwest at high speed. The American destroyers wove back and forth, laying smoke screens that partially obscured the cruisers from Japanese gunners. The Japanese destroyers, meanwhile, were attempting to work around the American flanks to achieve torpedo attack positions. The light cruisers on both sides engaged when opportunity permitted, adding their rapid-firing guns to the crescendo of battle. As the battle entered its second hour, the tactical situation had evolved into a complex dance of maneuver and gunfire. Admiral McMorris, recognizing that he could not win a straightforward gunnery duel against the superior Japanese force, had adopted a strategy of fighting a running battle while gradually working westward. His hope was to draw the Japanese far enough from their convoy that the transports would be forced to abandon their mission, while also positioning his force closer to American air bases in case weather permitted air support. At 1,000 hours, Salt Lake City's situation began to deteriorate. The concentrated fire from Nachi and Maya was becoming increasingly accurate. At 1002, an 8-inch shell from Maya struck Salt Lake City's aircraft hangar, starting a fire that threatened the ship's aviation fuel storage. Damage control parties rushed to contain the blaze, while the cruiser's guns continued to return fire. At 1010, another hit struck near the stern, causing flooding in several compartments and reducing the ship's speed slightly. The Japanese were not escaping, unscathed. Richmond had found the range to Tama and was scoring hits with her 6-inch guns. Though individually less damaging than heavy cruiser shells, the rapid fire from Richmond's guns was causing cumulative damage to the Japanese light cruiser. More significantly, at 1018, Salt Lake City scored a critical hit on Nachi. An 8-inch armor-piercing shell penetrated the Japanese flagship's hull below the waterline, causing serious flooding and forcing her to reduce speed. The American destroyers had been attempting to reach attack position throughout the battle, but the Japanese screen had effectively kept them at bay. At 1020, Dale and Monahan made an aggressive thrust toward the Japanese line, hoping to launch torpedoes at the heavy cruisers. The Japanese destroyers Ikazuchi and Inazuma immediately countered, and a fierce destroyer action developed on the battle's southern flank. Though no torpedoes found their mark, the American destroyers' aggressive action forced the Japanese to divide their attention and temporarily reduce the pressure on Salt Lake City. By 1100, the battle had been raging for over 2 hours, and the strain was showing on both sides. Salt Lake City had been hit 5 times and was struggling with flooding and fires. Her ammunition expenditure had been heavy, over 800 rounds of 8-inch shells fired, and her magazines were beginning to run low. Richmond had escaped serious damage, but was also concerned about ammunition supply. The Japanese heavy cruisers had suffered several hits each, and Nachi's flooding was becoming a serious concern for Admiral Hosogaya. The critical moment of the battle came at 1103, when Salt Lake City's engineering spaces suffered a catastrophic casualty. Saltwater from earlier flooding contaminated the fuel oil, feeding the after-fire room boilers, causing them to lose power. The ship's speed dropped dramatically, and for several terrifying minutes, she lay nearly dead in the water, a sitting target for the Japanese cruisers. Captain Bertram Rogers immediately ordered all available pumps to transfer oil from undamaged tanks, while his engineers worked frantically to restore power. Admiral McMorris faced the most difficult decision of the battle. Salt Lake City was temporarily helpless, and the Japanese were closing range to finish her off. McMorris could abandon the damaged cruiser and save the rest of his force, or he could risk everything in a desperate attempt to protect her. Without hesitation, McMorris chose to fight. He ordered Richmond to make smoke to cover Salt Lake City, while simultaneously ordering all destroyers to prepare for a torpedo attack against the Japanese line. At 1105, Commander Ralph Riggs commanding the destroyer division, led Bailey, Coughlin, and Monahan in what appeared to be a suicide charge directly at the Japanese heavy cruisers. The three destroyers, racing at maximum speed through their own smokescreen, presented minimal targets while threatening the Japanese with their torpedo batteries. It was a magnificent bluff. The destroyers had already expended most of their torpedoes in earlier skirmishes, but the Japanese didn't know this. The Japanese reaction to the destroyer attack proved decisive. Admiral Hosagaya, already concerned about his ammunition expenditure and the damage to his flagship, saw the American destroyer charge as the prelude to a coordinated torpedo attack. At 1,108, he ordered his force to turn away to avoid the expected torpedo spread. This turn, intended to last only long enough for the torpedoes to pass, would never be reversed. As the Japanese turned away, Salt Lake City's engineers achieved a miracle. At 1,110, power was restored to the after fire room, and the ship began to regain speed. Though still damaged in flooding, she was again able to maneuver and fight. Captain Rogers immediately ordered his guns to resume firing, sending a defiant message to the Japanese that the American cruiser was far from finished. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands effectively ended at 1,115, when Admiral Hosagaya, having opened the range during his torpedo evasion maneuver, decided not to re-engage. Several factors influenced his decision. His flagship was damaged and flooding, his ammunition supplies were running dangerously low after 3 hours of continuous combat, and he remained concerned about potential American air attacks as the day progressed. Most importantly, his transports were now far to the northwest, essentially unprotected and vulnerable to any American forces that might be in the area. Hosagaya's decision to retire sparked controversy within the Japanese Navy. Critics argued that he had victory within his grasp. Salt Lake City was severely damaged, American ammunition was running low, and his force still possessed superior firepower. However, Hosagaya's defenders pointed out that he had successfully protected his transports, the primary objective of the mission, and had avoided potentially catastrophic losses in waters far from Japanese bases. The tactical debate would continue long after the war, but the strategic implications were immediately clear. For the Americans, the battle represented a remarkable defensive victory against superior odds. Admiral McMorris had successfully prevented the Japanese convoy from reaching Attu, achieving his primary mission objective despite facing a significantly stronger enemy force. Salt Lake City, though battered with 7 hits and significant flooding, remained afloat and combat capable. Richmond had escaped with minimal damage, and none of the American destroyers had been seriously hit. American casualties totaled 7 killed and 20 wounded, remarkably light considering the intensity of the engagement. The Japanese had suffered comparable damage without achieving their mission. Nachi and Maya had each taken several hits, with Nachi's flooding requiring immediate dockyard attention upon return to Paramushiro. The light cruiser Tama had also sustained damage from Richmond's accurate gunfire. Japanese casualties were 14 killed and 27 wounded. More significantly, the failure to deliver supplies and reinforcements to Attu would have immediate operational consequences. The battle's most important outcome was its effect on Japanese strategy in the Aleutians. The failure of the convoy convinced Japanese naval leadership that surface supply operations to Attu were no longer viable. Future supply efforts would rely entirely on submarines, which could deliver only a fraction of the materials needed to properly defend the island. This decision essentially sealed Attu's fate. When American forces invaded Attu on the 11th of May, 1943, the Japanese garrison, weakened by months of inadequate supplies and unable to receive reinforcements, was overwhelmed after bitter fighting. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands also demonstrated several important tactical lessons that would influence naval operations for the remainder of the war. The effectiveness of destroyer smokescreens in protecting larger vessels was definitively proven. The importance of damage control and engineering resilience was highlighted by Salt Lake City's recovery from near catastrophic engineering failure. The battle also showed that surface actions could still occur in the age of air power when weather or distance prevented air operations. For the United States Navy, the battle became a source of considerable pride. The courage displayed by the destroyer commanders in their charge against the Japanese line entered naval legend. Commander Riggs would receive the Navy Cross for his leadership during the action. Captain Rogers of Salt Lake City would also receive the Navy Cross for his ship's handling throughout the engagement. Admiral McMorris's tactical acumen in fighting a successful delaying action against a superior force was studied at the Naval War College for years afterward. The Japanese Navy conducted its own analysis of the battle, reaching sobering conclusions about their tactical doctrine. The failure to aggressively pursue a wounded enemy when holding superior firepower was seen as a critical error. The effectiveness of American damage control and the resilience of American ships under fire were noted with concern. Perhaps most importantly, the battle reinforced growing doubts about Japan's ability to maintain isolated garrisons in the face of American naval opposition. In the broader context of the Pacific War, the Battle of the Komandorski Islands remained a relatively minor engagement, overshadowed by the massive carrier battles and island invasions that dominated headlines. Yet its significance extended beyond its immediate tactical results. It marked the last attempt by the Japanese to supply their Aleutian garrisons by surface convoy, effectively dooming these outposts. It demonstrated that American naval forces, even when outnumbered, could successfully defend against Japanese surface forces through superior tactics and determination. The battle also had an unexpected diplomatic dimension. Fought within sight of the Soviet-controlled Komandorski Islands, it was observed by Soviet forces who remained strictly neutral despite their proximity to the action. Soviet observers reported the battle to Moscow, providing Stalin with direct evidence of American naval capabilities and determination. Some historians argue that this demonstration of American naval power in waters close to Soviet territory influenced Stalin's later decisions regarding Soviet entry into the Pacific War. For the participants, the Battle of the Komandorski Islands remained a defining experience. Veterans of both sides would later describe it as one of the most intense surface actions of the war, a 3.5-hour running fight that tested ships and men to their limits. The battle demonstrated that even in an age of aircraft carriers and submarines, traditional surface combat between cruisers and destroyers could still decide strategic outcomes. The Aleutian campaign would continue for several more months after the battle. American forces successfully invaded Attu in May 1943, fighting a bitter 3-week battle that resulted in the virtual annihilation of the Japanese garrison. The Japanese, recognizing the hopelessness of their position, successfully evacuated the Kiska garrison in late July under cover of fog, ending their occupation of American territory. The Komandorski Islands battle had been the turning point that made these American victories possible. In the years following World War II, the Battle of the Komandorski Islands has received renewed attention from naval historians who recognize its unique nature as the last traditional cruiser action in the Pacific War. The battle demonstrated that superior firepower alone does not guarantee victory. Tactical skill, determination, and sometimes pure courage can overcome numerical disadvantages. The American success in preventing the Japanese convoy from reaching Attu, achieved against odds that would have justified retreat, stands as a testament to the fighting spirit of the United States Navy. The battle also serves as a reminder of the global nature of World War II. While the great battles of Midway, Guadalcanal, and the Philippine Sea dominate Pacific War histories, smaller actions like Komandorski Islands played crucial roles in the overall strategic picture. The isolation and eventual recapture of the Aleutian Islands freed American resources for use elsewhere, eliminated a potential threat to Alaska and the Pacific Northwest, and demonstrated American resolve to reclaim every piece of occupied territory. Today, the Battle of the Komandorski Islands is commemorated by both the United States and Japan as an example of naval courage and determination. The harsh waters where the battle was fought remain largely empty, visited only by fishing vessels and the occasional military patrol. Yet for one day, in March 1943, these remote waters witnessed one of the most remarkable surface actions of World War II, a battle that proved that skill and determination could prevail against superior numbers. The lessons learned from the engagement continue to influence naval thinking. The importance of maintaining the initiative, even when outnumbered, remains a fundamental principle of naval warfare. The critical role of damage control in preserving combat capability under fire is still emphasized in naval training. The courage required to charge superior forces, as demonstrated by the American destroyers, continues to inspire naval officers facing difficult tactical decisions. As the last survivors of the battle pass into history, their legacy endures in the annals of naval warfare. The Battle of the Komandorski Islands stands as proof that victory in war often depends not on material superiority, but on the skill, courage, and determination of those who fight. In the gray waters south of the Komandorski Islands, American sailors proved that they possessed these qualities in abundance, turning what could have been a devastating defeat into a strategic victory that helped secure the North Pacific for the Allied cause.